welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are studying Jacob chapters 5 through 7. Believe it or not, we're finishing up the book of Jacob. I hope you had a fantastic weekend listening to General Conference and that you feel refreshed and renewed to just dive into those scriptures this week. I cannot wait. In Jacob 5 through 7, we've got to talk about the longest chapter in the entire Book of Mormon. I'm sure many of you already knew that, but Jacob chapter 5 is the longest chapter in the entire Book of Mormon by a long shot. Like, there's not even any close competitors here. And what we call it is the allegory of the olive tree. And what's happening in chapter 5 is Jacob, remember Jacob is Nephi's younger brother, and Nephi has already died. Jacob is in possession of the plates. He's not the ruler, but he's in possession of the plates. And he is going to quote the prophet Zenos in telling the allegory of the olive tree. So it's Zenos who told the allegory. Jacob's now gonna write that. First of all, coming from an English teacher perspective, what's an allegory? Allegory is basically a really long comparison between two things. So most of us are probably familiar with similes and metaphors, right? Those are much shorter, right? They can be accomplished in a sentence or two, whereas allegories are a lot longer, and this definitely qualifies as a lot longer than a sentence. So what are the two things we're comparing here? Zenos is comparing a vineyard of olive trees to the past and the ultimate fate of the house of Israel. That's it. That's all. So he's using this comparison of vineyard of olive trees to tell us about what has happened in the past for the house of Israel and what will happen in the future for the house of Israel. And so that's what Zenos is going to tell us. Now, there is so much that you could dive into in this chapter. But what I want to do to help you out is to get you started with a few common interpretations of what a lot of these comparisons are. We have the overarching comparison that it's all about the history of the house of Israel. But what are some of the specific elements? I want to help you out so you can feel a little more confident as you approach reading this allegory. First of all, the vineyard itself is a comparison for the world. That one's easy. And the master of the vineyard is Jesus Christ. You're then going to hear a lot about branches, and branches are groups of people. Different groups of people are called branches. So if they're taking a branch and moving a branch, we're talking about groups of people that are being moved or converted or whatever it is. It's a group of people. Servants. Servants are the prophets, but also anyone else who's working with the Lord to bring the gospel to the world. So anyone who's willing to help out in the vineyard is a servant. We then have tame olive trees, and tame olive trees are the house of Israel. People who are members of the house of Israel, right? Descendants of Israel / Jacob and all of his sons. That is a tame olive tree. And then a wild olive tree would be anyone who's not in the house of Israel, also known as Gentiles. Gentiles, someone who is not in the house of Israel. So tame is house of Israel, wild is a Gentile, someone who is not in the house of Israel or hasn't even been adopted into the house of Israel. Okay, there's a few actions that take place that I also want to make sure you are aware of. If an olive tree is decaying olive trees, that refers to an apostasy that's decaying, right? There's also going to be times when someone is going to graft wild branches into tame trees. So think about everything I just told you. They're taking wild branches, aka a group of people who are not in the house of Israel, and they're going to graft it into the house of Israel. That means they're being baptized in. It's talking about groups of people who are being baptized or converted or adopted into the house of Israel. People who are changing from wild to tame, meaning changing from not in the house of Israel to being part of the Lord's covenant people. Kind of cool to think about it that way. There's also going to be times where it talks about how the master transplants some branches from tame trees into distant parts of the vineyard. So if branches of a tame olive tree are groups of people from the house of Israel, this is known as the scattering of Israel. The scattering of Israel, tame branches are taken away into far off places within the vineyard. And then kind of the reverse of that is that when there's this final like nourishing and pruning and grafting that's going to happen, this is referring to the restoration and the final days, the last days, things that have already happened in the past couple hundred years, but also things that will happen in the future as well. I hope that helps you. Now go into Jacob 5 and just think about those symbols, see what you can grasp from it. You're going to see that the Lord is very concerned about his vineyard, and he really wants to help keep it tame. He wants all of the branches to become tame, and he's going to do what he can with these tame branches and wild branches and decaying and all that kind of stuff to try and save. And the servants are going to come in and try and save as well. And we'll kind of see the fate of that at the end. Ultimately, the rest are burned from the field. And that's kind of what ends this allegory in chapter 5. Okay, I said though, whose allegory is this? It's the prophet Zenos. And you might be like, can you remind me who Zenos is? I don't quite remember. Yeah, I will remind you, but Zenos it's kind of interesting. Zenos was an Old Testament prophet, probably around the same time as Isaiah, but we don't have record of him in the Old Testament. So when I say Old Testament prophet, I mean Old Testament times. That's the time period. But people who only have the Bible are not aware of Zenos at all. Now, there were lots of prophets around that time. This is right before, but likely right before Jerusalem was conquered. Isaiah was there, but there were also tons of other prophets. I mean, we know Lehi was there as well, right? He's prophesying. And we don't know exactly when Zenos lived, but obviously it needed to happen before 600 BC so that Lehi and then Nephi and then Jacob could have record of what Zenos was preaching. And if we look at the things that we know about Zenos, we can kind of figure out that Zenos was a descendant of Joseph of the house of Israel. So Joseph of Egypt was his lineage there. We know that he prophesied, of course, about the scattering and gathering of Israel, as we can see in the allegory of the olive tree. But Zenos also made some prophecies about Jesus Christ. Now, when you read through chapter 5, you might be like, well, where are these prophecies? I don't see them. And that's because we actually hear about Zenos in quite a few other places in the Book of Mormon. It's not just Jacob 5, and Jacob 6 mentions him a little bit as well. But Zenos is clearly an important prophet to these Book of Mormon people, and they have his words. In fact, I looked it up. So 1 Nephi 19, he was already mentioned. Alma 33 and Alma 34, Zenos is quoted or mentioned. Helaman chapter 8, Helaman chapter 15, and 3 Nephi chapter 10. Zenos is quoted or paraphrased or referred to in all of these instances in the Book of Mormon. So it's kind of interesting to look at. It's like clearly they knew Zenos really well, and we don't have any of his original writings, but it's cool to have at least some interpretations. The one prophecy that we'll see about Jesus that is especially important is that Zenos was the prophet who prophesied that Jesus would be laid in a sepulcher. His body would be laid in a sepulcher. And so that specifically is referred to in the Book of Mormon. And I just thought this was really interesting. Bruce R. McConkie said that in his belief, next to Isaiah, Zenos was one of the greatest prophets in ancient Israel. Which is kind of cool. Clearly he was quoted a lot, right? Like people loved what Zenos wrote. And obviously Isaiah had a little more, but Zenos was there with him We just don't have those original records of him in Old Testament times, which is kind of a bummer, but it's cool to get this interpretation of what he's taught. So enjoy that as you go through chapter 5. See what Zenos is teaching, what you can glean about the house of Israel, the gathering and the scattering, what you can learn about the qualities of the master of the vineyard, and how you as a servant can help. Lots of cool things to look at. All right, chapter 6 is then a very short chapter. After chapter 5, you're like, I need a short one. And he gives it to you. It's so nice. And this is pretty much just Jacob adding his commentary to what he just quoted from Zenos. So he's going to just add his witness to what Zenos says. He's going to testify of Jesus Christ. He's going to call his people to repentance as well. And then it's kind of interesting. I'm just inferring here. I'm reading between the lines. I think Jacob thought he was done after chapter 6, because at the end of chapter 6, he's giving advice to his people. Turn to the Lord, repent. And then he's saying bye. He's saying goodbye at the end of chapter 6. But luckily, it doesn't stop there. We get one more amazing chapter before we finish off the book of Jacob. I imagine that Jacob was like, hey, I'm done. And then this next event happened. He's like, okay, hold on. I gotta fit this in before I really pass this on. This is all my interpretation. Chapter 7 has a fantastic story, so don't ignore it. I know Jacob 5 is a big one, but focus on chapter 7 too, of a man named Sherem, Sherem. And Sherem came into the land telling everyone that, guess what? Jesus actually is not coming. He's not real. He's not coming. And unfortunately, Sherem convinces a lot of the Nephites. He's starting to lead a lot of people astray. And of course, Jacob's very concerned about the spiritual welfare of his people. He already was concerned, right? We read last week some very strong teachings Jacob was getting to his people. And now we've got Sherem leading even more people astray. And so this confrontation happens where Sherem approaches Jacob and is like, why are you deceiving the people? This is Sherem to Jacob. Why are you deceiving the people? Why are you telling them that Christ will come? And Jacob, I love his response, because he does not even entertain the fact that this might be a conversation. And Jacob just bears powerful testimony of Jesus Christ. There's no arguing. Jacob knows that Jesus is real. That's it. That's all you need to know. And as he's doing this, Jacob says that the Lord will give Sherem a sign, and Sherem is struck down, and for a few days he is asleep, appears to be asleep, and after a few days he wakes up, and Sherem knows he's about to die after this, and he admits that he had been deceived by a devil, and he testifies of Jesus Christ, and then Sherem dies. And here's the interesting part. His final testimony, when Sherem wakes up and shares this powerful testimony of Jesus Christ, that helps convert many of the Nephites. That's what gets them back on track, is Sherem's testimony. I just think it's fascinating what kind of an interesting roundabout way the Lord answered the prayers of Jacob that he shared in last chapter. And then at the very end, Jacob mentions that he is now passing the plates on to his son named Enos. So I can't wait to talk about Enos when we dive into him next week. There's a lot going on next week. It's a whole bunch of small books. That's what we call them. We are covering hundreds of years, not exaggerating, hundreds of years. We're doing flashbacks and moving all sorts of places. I just want to remind you, if you have not grabbed my Big Picture, Little Picture study guide, go ahead and grab it right now. There are 13 weeks in total, so we still have 12 weeks left because it started last week. But grab this. This will help you make sense of it all. You can grab it on Amazon or as a digital download. And then good luck. As you read Jacob 5, a lot of times we want to chunk things up, right? I'm going to split Jacob 5 into 4 sections or whatever. But I'd actually recommend try reading it all in one go. Like, clear some time, set some time aside, get your brain ready. Because sometimes when we stop and go so much, our brain has a hard time. It's like we're dipping our toes in and then we take them back out and we forget it. Try reading it all in one go and see if that has an effect on how you feel and believe about what's being taught in Jacob 5. All right, good luck this week. I think my personal focus question is going to be about how I can make sure my spiritual roots are always being nourished. Okay, have a great week and happy studying.